Okay. I think, yes, it says we're recording. All right, thanks, you guys.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for that. Welcome, and thanks everyone for having us, giving some time of your meeting for us. As Lynn mentioned, I'm Sarah, and I run basically public facing things for the Conservation District. And we're here tonight to talk about one of our most favorite subjects, especially Sarah and I.
They may not be able to hear you.
Ooh, should I come over here?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, I don't have a mic or anything, huh? Are people saying they can hear us if we're right here? In a online land? Okay. I tend to move, but I'll try to stay put.
Okay. I'll be sharing. Okay.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully they can hear us. Yeah, so we're here to talk about native plants, one of our most favorite things, and I'm sure near and dear to many of your hearts as well. And I'm sure in this room, people are coming to native plants from all range of experience, whether you've never gardened with them or it's like all you do. There's a huge spectrum there. And we're really here to showcase some of the best native plants for home landscaping and specific to different.
They can hear us. We're good.
Cool. Thanks, Jill. Specific to different types of sites that you might have. So we're going to go through 4 different site conditions, and we have some really great handouts, one for each of those sites, so you can take as you go for a little handy guideline there. But something really important to remember is you may have all 4 of these in your, quarter-acre plot, and there's so many little micro habits that go on in a backyard. So this is just sort of a very general, broad overview, but yeah, every place is a little bit different. So getting to know, as you already know, as gardeners, getting to know your specific spot is super duper important. Click maybe instead of, aha. Okay, so native plants. How many people have done some native plant, like gardening plant? Oh, yay. That's such a good number. Yeah, so you probably already know how amazing and awesome they are, not just for wildlife and for your soil and for water, but for, people too, and how valuable they can be in the landscape. Oh, that's weird. There we go. So probably you're familiar with native species, but always good to sort of define what we're talking about. And technically a native species is one that was present before the arrival of European colonists, settlers. So a lot of those are now, extinct, or they become very rare. Some of them are still thriving. So it doesn't include plants that are native to like other very different ecoregions. And that gets into a little bit of like nitty gritty / conflict in the plant world. Even though we're all friends, this is something that people like to, argue about. Oh yeah, naturalized species. Have you guys heard that term, naturalized? So that's something that, was not native here originally, but it's not really causing any harm. It's just kind of settled in here. It's not really causing huge issues or competing a lot with the native species. But how native should it be? Because, there's everything from super hyper local, like the Willamette daisy or fleabane, that is literally only found in, you would know this better than me, like probably a handful of spots, right?
Only found in wet prairies here in the Willamette Valley.
Yeah, like literally just right here, versus something like a blue blossom, which probably a lot of you have planted or seen around. Great landscape plant, but it's really only commonly native to more like Southern Oregon. But something really important to think about, and something you all probably talk about too, is, with climate changes, as our climate changes, if we do get, hotter, drier conditions, some of these species are going to start to creep probably further north, right? So something like blue blossom might be a great thing to plant now in preparation for, the conditions becoming more right for it. And unfortunately, that might mean, the exit of maybe more sensitive things like the daisy. But it's always kind of good to think of, planning and gardening, not just for this year, this, decade, but even further down the road. So all that being said, as native as you can get is really the best, right? Because there are really specific pollinators for specific plants. And sometimes those things are only found, in a very small radius of each other. So if you can find things like a Willamette daisy or a Willamette, thing, that is probably the best thing you can do, but they're harder to find, right? Especially at, commercial nurseries. So if you can look for something that's, more regional, more Oregon native, even like west of the Rockies native, that's good too. It's all good if it's, as long as it's not a highly exotic, invasive species. So my point with that is to like not, worry too much. If it's not super hyper local, it's still going to do some good in your garden for sure. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna also try to look at the camera to not ignore people that are here on Zoom joining us. But hi, everyone. So this slide is just kind of talking about Oregon as a state and how we have so many different ecosystems. Oregon's a beautiful state in that it has a wide range of habitats. So as the slide says, Oregon has over 36,000 species of native plants and a bunch of different habitats like evergreen forests, mixed deciduous forests. My favorites are dry prairie and oak savanna because that's what I've worked in a lot. Also wet prairie. As we've said when we introduce everybody, I've worked in the past with a lot of Oregon's rare and endangered plant species. So I kind of get to have like a little bit of knowledge about some of the plants that are not available commercially, but are very, very important and threatened here in Oregon ecosystems. And so this is just kind of to clue you in on, there's a lot of different habitats that you can have, like Sarah said, even in a small space in your property. So it's all about choosing the right conditions, and that is kind of what prompted our talk for today. So what does your garden want to be is the question. And we'll get into, like Sarah said, we have 4 main type of like site conditions. We'll go through a couple of species, and then after everybody is done, we also have some handouts of species that fall into these 4 different categories for everybody to take if you want. And we also have some printouts of the presentation in general if you want that for reference. So Sarah and I are going to kind of trade off here, but just to clue us in before we get started, we're talking about dry and wet type of site conditions, but that's kind of subjective, right? Like, what does that really mean? Obviously site conditions vary depending on the season. Like everything is very dry in the summer and everything's really wet in the winter, right? So it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? How do I determine if my site is more dry or more wet? So I'm coming at this where I'm describing like wet conditions based on soil moisture during most of the summer. So even when sometimes like we have a lot of clay soil in the valley, even sometimes when the top surface of the soil is very like rock hard, looks like a desert, there's still moisture underneath that. So it gets at how much moisture do you have at what depth, basically. So we're going to see throughout the presentation tonight that there's a lot of references to well-drained or poorly drained. We're talking about soil moisture, and you can kind of think of it as like, if the soil is wet, obviously it's like standing water or like, just like a lot of obvious visible moisture. If it's well drained, it's kind of like there's water that percolates through the soil a lot easier. Poorly drained is water that doesn't, it pools. So these are just some of the terms you'll hear me say. Feel free to ask again to reiterate. So wet conditions, soil moisture during much of the summer, or if you have a high water table. As we were preparing, Sarah gave a really good example of her backyard. That's kind of like right on the river.
I'm right on the river, and right now my back acre is like, looks like a lake, but it is not in the summer, it's bone dry. So I would consider that like a wet prairie because even though it dries out in the summer, I know that water table is really close to the surface, so I can plant more like wet prairie species because those roots will get down to that.
Yeah. And one other thing to keep in mind before we jump into and switch off with these different site conditions is that a lot of these species kind of have some variability. So there will be species that we might put in one category, but can totally thrive in another. It kind of just depends on a lot of micro conditions, as Sarah said too. So try to be flexible in your thinking too. It's not just, oh, this plant can only be in this type of site condition. Sometimes they can defy expectations. So as the slide says, some of them show preferences, but many native species can thrive in multiple different types of site conditions. Don't feel siloed. Sometimes you just got to try and see what works. All right, you're up on the dry.
Okay, I'm doing the dry site conditions, which I have worked with quite a bit as a, both resource management person and just in my own property. So again, when we're talking about dry, we're thinking relatively dry kind of throughout the year, right? So everything's drier in the summer, everything's wetter in the winter. But one of the most common dry shade conditions is like, you know, a heavy forest with a really heavy canopy. Not a lot of moisture is making it down to the roots. Some of you might have this if you have, like, I have a huge sequoia, and underneath is, even in the heavy winter, it stays pretty darn dry, just from that giant umbrella over it. And this is probably what we hear about or get asked about the most, is how do I garden in this condition? It's considered kind of the most challenging, right? Because it's not getting a lot of water. It's not getting really a lot of sun, if any direct sun. But not surprisingly, here in Oregon, that's a pretty common ecosystem, is in those heavy forests. So we have a lot of native species that do great in dry shade. And these are very hardy things, obviously, if they're able to survive without a ton of light and, you know, really tap down into whatever moisture is there. Or a lot of them may go into like a dormant state, and they'll sort of disappear in the summer, but then they pop back up, you know, in the fall. They're really, really adaptive that way. So a really great one for kind of like a slow spreading ground cover is the dwarf Oregon grape, which is Mahonia, although they recently changed it to Berberis. So if you know the Mahonia genus, now it's Berberis.
We always have like favorites sometimes.
These things change all the time. It's really
I
annoying.
prefer Mahonia, but yeah.
Too. But it is related to the tall Oregon grape, as you might have guessed, and it's kind of like a mini, you know, little cousin of that. And it's a much more of a spreader. You'll see it all the time in kind of shady, foresty areas here around Corvallis. And it can do fine in, you know, more wet areas, but you'll see it a lot of times in these dry shade conditions, kind of under big evergreen canopies. And just like the tall Oregon grape, it has great yellow flowers. It's a really early bloomer, so that's super important to pollinators that are coming out of that, you know, winter hibernation. And it has rhizomes that'll kind of spread under the ground. So you won't get a, you know, instant ground cover, but it's a good sort of planning ahead plant, where if you want something to kind of spread around, you know, several feet, it's a really good one to choose. And I also found out, I didn't really know this, but in doing this presentation, that a lot of people use it on steep slopes. And I hadn't thought of it as like a steep slope plant, but apparently it can be used with a lot of success there. And that's another tough area to garden in. So a really good one to keep in mind for that, you know, sort of condition. We also chose to spotlight snowberry, which is very common. It occurs kind of almost everywhere. I know I have a ton. There's all along the roadside, but that's for a good reason. They're very hardy. So this is one that, you know, we put into this dry shade site condition, but you'll see it in a lot of different sort of conditions. It has really pretty foliage. If you're not familiar with it, a lot of people use it in like cut flower arrangements, and cute little pink flowers. And then the kind of the coolest feature about it, at least from a design perspective, is those white berries that are here throughout the winter. So if you're seeing white berries right now, that's snowberry. So that's a really great one for kind of winter interest. And those little flowers are great for little pollinators that need to get kind of up in it. And I think ants are actually a big one with snowberry. So, you know, thinking of pollinators beyond the bees, right? There's things that are not hibernating in the winter that still need this sort of food source all throughout the season. And again, very resilient, like almost any soil type. You'll probably, if you didn't know this plant, now you're going to see these white berries everywhere. Say, now I know. And then this is one of my little favorites, the inside out flower. I grow them at my place, and they're so like little and cute. But they have this really unique stamen that sort of, it looks like someone like turned the umbrella inside out. I guess that's why it got its name. But this is another one you'll see. If you kind of look for it, you'll see it all around different forests around here. And it has these little kind of, they call it like duck foot shaped leaves. And it looks very delicate and fragile, but it's really hardy and it'll survive. I've had the leaves on there. Sometimes it'll go dormant in the summer. I've had them stay on like through the whole summer. And then, yeah, it has those little kind of white flowers that pop up on these stems that are really long blooming. Like this says May to July. I think I had mine going till September. So another really good, that's kind of like a smaller, you know, for a good like dappled shade, sort of, you know, darker area that maybe you want a little bit of color, a little bit of, you know, brightness from some flowers. That's another really good choice. And we just picked 3 for each of the site conditions, and it was very hard to choose. We had a lot of debates friendly debates about this, because there really are so many for all these site conditions. So those lists we mentioned that are on this table have, lots of species for each of these 4 conditions. So don't feel limited. We just sort of picked our favorites, honestly.
Cool. Okay, and I'm doing the wet site conditions. One other thing that I want to note too before I move on to this slide is that this presentation highlights a lot of like shrubs and forbs, but there's also on those sheets a lot of grasses too, native grasses that can go into, and trees that can go into these types of site conditions. So there are more options out there. So I personally am very drawn to like wetter site conditions. Is kind of why I am a transplant from Southern California up here to Oregon. So talking about the wet shade site condition, plants that fall into this category, going back to that soil moisture point. So moist, standing water, wet. You hear me say well drained or poorly drained. So well drained being, it rains, the water percolates through the soil. It's not standing water. Poorly drained soil is when it rains and it pools. So standing water. So plants that I'm about to feature can fall and tolerate those type of conditions, soil moisture wise. And then also we're talking about shade. So these species thrive in partial or full shade. So again, some of the riparian, more forest understories are a good thing to key in, that this could be that kind of site condition that you're looking for. This is a really pretty picture from Clemens Park in LC. And I got very familiar with that this past fall season because I got to do my first Salmon Watch season with Sara. If anybody knows what Salmon Watch is. Yeah, plug.
It's our K-12 education program we run every fall, and we also need tons of volunteers for that every year. And you get to take kids on hikes through the forest and look for salmon and do experiments, and it's super fun. So if that sounds cool to you, just reach out. We'll get you trained.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about a couple. This one is really cute. This is Fringe Cup. Scientific name is Telema grandiflora. I love this plant because you do typically find it in these like forest understories and shade, and it's just such an intricate little thing. It has these kind of fuzzy, maybe heart-shaped leaves, but they have some kind of scalloping edges. They're also a little bit fuzzy. It's a little hard to tell from the pictures that I chose, but they've got some hairs going on the leaves and on the stems. Spreading perennial. So if you're looking for a species that can do some ground cover in a shaded area, this is a good one. Like it says on there, you can create thick patches of ground cover, and it's just a really pretty thing. I like the flowers and then just the leaves because I am a very big like plant identification nerd, obviously. And so I'm like, oh, this one I will never not identify right because it's so distinct looking. So this is a really pretty one. Another little pop of color that you might see in some riparian or wet areas is stream violet. This is Viola gabella. Another little low growing perennial has these cute, more like heart-shaped leaves, and a little pop of yellow color. I saw this one most recently in the wild, hiking around Aussie Falls. There's a bunch of them out in that area, and I really like this plant and this little flower because it's like this delicate little thing, and it also has this interesting dark like veination in the middle of it that's really cool. This is also another type of plant that can do some kind of like ground cover spread. So it's a really pretty little thing that's usually found in forest or understories near streams, things like that. And then the next one I'm going to show you is pretty similar looking on first glance to Fringe Cup, but it is different. And the plant nerd in me loves to like point out differences and identification factors. So this one is very similar. This is piggyback flower, and it has that name for a very specific reason. Tolmia menzii. Another plant that is found in like shaded near wet areas type of thing. And the leaves are kind of similar. They're a little bit more angular. They come to more of a point than the Fringe Cup. And then the reason that it got its name, which I think is very cute, is that it has this growth habit of actually starting new leaves like in the middle of a leaf that's already formed. So you can kind of see, I put this arrow here. You can see that little tiny leaf that is forming. So it's kind of like that little leaf is piggybacking off of an existing leaf and growing. Very similar to French cup in that it grows on like this ascending stalk that's a little bit hairy. You can kind of see that the flowers are a little bit different. They're more tubular. They have this like wild like fringe thing happening at the ends of them, but it's a really pretty flower. Yeah, so those are the 3 for wet shade.
And something cool about one of my favorite things is that these are one of our few native plants that we kind of promote as like good for container gardening, because a lot of folks don't have, you know, soil in the ground. They're like, I'm in an apartment and I have a patio.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah, you know. And I haven't tried it myself to grow these in, you know, hanging baskets, but we have been told that these, you know, because of that piggybacking quality, they'll kind of grow these cascades kind of over a hanging basket. So something really fun to try. And then jumping to our next dry conditions, dry sun. This is another one that people are like, oh, I can't do anything because my site is fully exposed and the, you know, the clay is rock hard. But again, these conditions exist in nature all over Oregon and, you know, the world truly. But there are, again, plenty of native plants that will happily live in conditions like this. It's just knowing their habit. It's knowing, you know, their root system plays a huge role, how they can survive those long drought summer periods without additional irrigation. So that's the key, right? Like you can have dry sun, but if you've got little hoses running all over the place, then, you know, you can create a wetter sunny area. But if you're really determined to save water and, you know, not do a lot of excess summer irrigation, these are some of the plants for you. So
make sure you're in the frame too.
oh yeah, maybe I'm not in the frame. Hello, sorry for those of you online. This is probably most people know this one. This is sort of a very iconic native landscaping shrub, the red flowering currant, or RFC, as we call it affectionately. And it is, you know, well known and well loved for a reason. It is absolutely beautiful when it's in full flower, and even through the winter. You know, a lot of times it keeps its foliage through the winter. And it has tons of these, you know, kind of whitish to dark reddish flowers that hummingbirds really, really love. So if you have one of these, you'll see hummingbirds all over them, bees, butterflies, you know, it's kind of a pollinator magnet. And it's also a really early nectar source. So it's probably one of the kind of early shrubs that you'll see blooming around here, along with like osoberry, which we'll mention, and like tall Oregon grape, the mahonias, or berberisses.
It doesn't ring the same way.
It does not. But yeah, you know, this just says just moths alone. Oh, moths and butterflies, 24 species. Oh, am I? Oh yeah, question. Yes.
I've tried like 6 times to get that going in different places. Is it known to have some struggles?
Oh yeah, if you're online and you didn't hear that, we had someone ask about getting this plant established and having some challenges with that. I haven't grown one from like bare root or from little. I have some super established ones just on my property that are probably decades old. Does anyone have experience with that in this room? Yeah.
Same experience.
Okay.
I'm very happy.
Yeah.
Very nicely in a part shading, slightly irrigated.
Okay.
situation, not bone dry, but I've seen them in those.
Yeah. My hunch is that how long it's established is super key for this one. So like we put it in dry sun, but that's kind of the established plant, right? So I'm betting its first few years at least, you need to keep it, you know, irrigate through the summer, right? To probably not drown those roots, because I'm betting since it becomes so drought tolerant, it probably won't like super wet feet. But maybe, you know, irrigate the first few summers, and then making sure, you know, maybe as it's little, having a little bit of shade over it. But, you know, again, mine that are super established are in very dry, sunny spots and blooming like this every year, and they're just happy as can be. So it's probably an age thing with the plants, and you have to sort of, you know, baby them the first few years and then let them do their thing. That's a great question. Yeah, and they're just lovely, and they're, you know, that big pop of color is very showy. This is one of my favorites too, but I don't see it as often around as I feel like it deserves. But this is one of our native irises, and non-native irises are so popular to grow, but our native ones are so pretty, especially Iris 10X here. Again, it looks, kind of delicate, like little, cottage garden plant, but it's really tough. This one has really tough rhizomes. So this one will actually spread. You can kind of see the picture, all the clumps all around it. So it'll spread via those rhizomes and form, if you want it to kind of fill in a big area, or they're super easy to, just control, but they can create tons of these really pretty iris flowers that are, purple, pinks, whites, yellows, really gorgeous, and also kind of low. So I think that they really only get like, this says 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall-ish. But one big thing with this is that it's another one that doesn't like wet feet. So though it's kind of drought resistant, you wouldn't really want to put it in clay because in the wintertime, all of those rhizomes and stuff are probably going to rot. So that's just a good thing to keep in mind. It's also a deer and rabbit resistant one, supposedly, although every time we tell someone something's deer resistant, they come and say, well, but the deer ain't mine. We're like, well, some deer maybe will be, not wanting to eat it, but there's always those deer that taste everything. But if you do have dogs and horses, there is some level of toxicity. So something to be aware of. And then finally, this is one that we're offering. So again, all of these that we've gone through are in our online native plants sale shop right now, and we checked and they're all still available. And this is a new one that we introduced this year to our sale, which is broadleaf stonecrop. So a lot of you are probably familiar with those little sedums. They're, super common in garden centers, and you'll see them growing in little, kind of sandy container pots. But a lot of people don't know we have these native sedums, which is pretty cool, and they're beautiful. They get kind of this purplish hue in the winter time, and then they send up these sort of, maybe 5 to 6 inch tall yellow stalks in the summer. Really popular for moths, especially like nighttime visitors. I think even bats maybe, although it might be a little low for that. But yeah, if you have sandy soil in like a hot, dry area, very well drained, sandy, like desert like soil, try some stone crops. And there's a couple of native ones. And we have these available this year for the first time in our plant sale. So that's cool too.
You're trying to plug that
We're
one.
plugging, yeah.
We're like, give them a
Yeah,
chance.
I promise they're great. And it doesn't even have to be honestly super sandy soil, as long as it's draining well, drains pretty quickly. You don't want to add any like compost or, any sort of fertilizers, because it wants for nothing. It just wants, the cruddiest soil you can offer it, which is great. Less work. Okay, one more.
All right, back to the wet, my specialty. Okay, so this is wet sun. This is like typically what you would consider like a wet prairie type of habitat. This is kind of the bread and butter. Species that fall into this category thrive when the soil is either moist, wet, so standing water, well drained, so water that just percolates, but it's pretty good deep moisture. And then these species thrive when they receive sun exposure for a significant portion of the day. Doesn't have to be all day, but a significant portion. This is a really pretty picture that I took while I was doing golden paintbrush surveys at Herbert Farm, a natural area here in Corvallis. If you've never been, you should definitely go in the spring. So many colors. Mm-hmm. So the first species that we're going to highlight is osoberry. This is also called Indian plum, Omlaria cerasiformis. A deciduous shrub. I personally really like osoberry because I'm skipping down to the end of the little text, but I get really excited when I see it because it's one of the very first early like blooming shrubs here in Corvallis. So when I go hiking in early like February or March area and I start seeing the little white flowers pop up and things, I'm like, oh, okay, spring's coming. We're almost out of it. Yeah, you can kind of see like a wider picture of the growth form of what it usually looks like, and then a more close-up picture of the flower inflorescence. Kind of hangs down in more like a panicle of these white flowers, and it's just a really pretty type of shrub. Yeah, and some people say that the leaves or flowers smell like cucumber when they get crushed. I don't know that, but
I'm gonna try it.
Yeah, you can test it if you can find it. I know that it's around like the McDonald Dun Forest.
Yeah,
There's-
PV has a
and
ton,
PV,
like that
yeah.
Discovery Trail.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, next one is red osier dogwood, Cornus serica. I love this one again because it's a really pretty pop of color throughout all of the seasons. So a larger shrub, it does well in moist soil, in sun, or parts shade. This is typically like, it has this reputation of being an easy to grow, easy to care for type of shrub. So if you're looking for, one that you can put in a certain spot and kind of just like let it do its thing, this is a good option. The species has a lot of like ethnobotany history too. Humans have used the hardwood of dogwood for basketry, wicker, and farm implements and a bunch of things. So if you're interested in some plants that also have some ethnobotany things, this is a really cool species. And then kind of just as I said, the species provides like all season interest. So it has the spring flowers, it has the white summer berries, colorful fall foliage, and then the really notable red type of branches in the winter. So lots of interest. And then last one we're going to highlight here for wet sun is monkey flower. This is Mimulus. I don't even know how to say that species name. Guttatus? Guttatus? Yeah. I really like this plant. This is one of the very few plants that I've seen in the wild that like really loves just being in standing water. So very much loves the wet conditions. If you're looking for a plant that spreads easily, this is one for you too, because it's an annual, it can either grow as an annual or a perennial. It kind of has different growth habits depending on where it is. Also spreads through rhizomes or self-seeding, kind of as we've talked about throughout today. Oh, we got a chat. What's going on?
Oh, lovely Osaberry long ball.
Oh, good to know. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I love pointing out where you can see these things like actually out, so you can kind of like see what it looks like, and you're like, okay,
where it's actually.
yeah. What's it doing? What's it liking? So yeah, very moist soil or wet standing water. Very good pop of color as yellow. It has these really cool little like speckled red dots in the inside. And this is another kind of like tubular flower. So this could be a good species for pollinators. Like, I don't know what necessarily visits this, but if you have like pollinators that need, to kind of like climb into the flowers, this is a good one too. And then seeds are a good source of food for small mammals and birds too.
I've heard for like rain gardens, if you're looking, in a rain garden, you kind of go from like wetter to drier things. And if you're looking for something to fill in like in the rain garden in that standing water, monkey flower is your gal.
Cool. All right. What do we got now? Let me click. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. And then we have a couple versatile
Yeah.
ones.
So as we were preparing this, we were like, man, there's so many. Oh yeah. I mean, there's so many that could fit in all four almost site conditions, because again, as native species, they've had eons to, evolve to all of our many different quirks in our climate here. So some may, do better or grow faster, or different growth forms in different, their preferred site conditions, but a lot of them really can survive, multiple different sites. So we picked, again, just a few, hard to narrow down, but a few that are sort of like the stars for versatility. Which one you're probably super familiar with is tall Oregon grape, but we could not mention it. You'll see it all around used in, city landscaping. It's a really popular one because it is evergreen. It's really hardy. It can be in those, quote unquote, like hell strips between the road and the sidewalk where it's getting that full sun, and they'll keep growing. In the wild, you'll see them more in like kind of part shade sort of places. But I mean, sometimes even on roadsides along the highway and things like that. So just like its, little cousin, the Cascade grape, it's got those great yellow flowers that are super early in the year, very tolerant of different sun, different soil. And apparently you can even make jelly with their grapes, the berries. Apparently they're very sour, so you need a lot of sugar. but they were eaten by native peoples, you know, especially combined with like other more, you know, probably like blackberries and things like that with more sugar. So yeah, great all around plant to kind of throw wherever, wherever you need something that's evergreen and gonna, you know, fill in that space. And vine maple is another really interesting one. It definitely has a preferred place you'll find it in the wild. Like you're not really likely to find it, I don't think, in like an open field in the wild per se, but it can survive in more open conditions. So its sort of preferred habitat is in that shadier undergrowth. You'll see it all over the place in that, you know, sort of underneath bigger trees, and it grows all, you know, like the name says, kind of windy underneath there. But if you grow it out in more open sun, as long as you're irrigating it, it can survive as more of like a out in the sun, and it'll grow this more like tree or large shrub sort of form rather than that twisty form. So that's kind of interesting to experiment with and see, you know, again, where in your microclimate it's happiest, but it would be a cool one to try in different sorts of conditions. And it has awesome fall color. If you haven't, you know, seen one around, it rivals all of those exotic maples that people plant for amazing fall color. And then the checker mallows, these are one of my very favorites. And there's there's a lot of different native species. Several of them are available through, you know, nurseries and native plant sales. I don't know that we have these three. I think we may not have Oregana this year, but we have the other two in our plant sale site. But they're really, if you love like hollyhocks or those sort of cottage garden, you know, upright sort of flowers, these are a really great native alternative for that, for like a hollyhock or foxglove. Huge pollinator magnets, and then different species thrive in different spots. So there's a checker mallow that's more sun. There's one that can handle more shade, one more wet, dry. So again, that info, they're kind of in the different site condition sheets over there. But that's a really cool one where you can just look at that genus and look into the different species and say, okay, like which one will grow in which corner of my backyard? And yeah, they even have a very big variation in color too. Like the campestris is almost whitish, very pale pink. Some of them get a lot darker magenta. So that's a fun one to play around with. And this says it will bloom, you know, throughout the summer if given supplemental water. And I can confirm that just from my own experience. Even if it only gets like one watering in the middle of the summer, it'll suddenly like spring back to life and you'll get a whole nother set of blooms. So a really great hardy plant.
A place before we move on to
Oh, yeah.
checker mallow is a good place to see some. Actually there's one species that was endangered that is no longer endangered, is Nelson's checker mallow. Recently got delisted, and I worked on that species a lot. You can find a big blooming field of it at Mary's River Natural Area here in Corvallis. Yeah, around the like June, July timeline. Beautiful field. And those ones get that kind of like deep magenta color. Okay. Just plug.
Yeah, this is yeah, do you want to?
Sure, yeah.
You go for it.
Okay, yeah, so that's kind of what we had for highlighting some species that can you know, go in these different type of site conditions, some that are a little bit versatile. I'm sure I don't really need to convince you about native plants, but you know, just to go over it, to be thorough, cross T's, dot I's. Native plants are drought resistant, they improve soil health, can prevent flooding, and are more resistant to some of the common like pests and diseases that we have, because they are adapted to you know, persist in the climate and conditions that we have here in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And then also, you know, selfishly with humans, save you time and save you money. No irrigation, fertilizing, or pesticides. Everything's going to have a different like you know, experience, but generally with native plants, the cost and maintenance tend to be lower. And then biodiversity, again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But native plants provide, you know, food and shelter for 10 to 15 times more species of birds and butterflies and other local wildlife, other than compared to non-native plants. Some of the species that we have highlighted here, we in the Willamette Valley very specifically are very excited about Fender's blue butterfly, which actually got downlisted. It's not endangered anymore, it's threatened. And its host plant is Kincaid's lupin, which is still threatened. So those are some of the like really important like pollinators and insect species that some of these native plants really do support here in the Willamette Valley.
And yeah, that fact, that was one that came as I was doing this research for this. 90% of insects can only develop and reproduce on specific plants, like
Yeah.
ones that they have, ones that are native basically to, which makes sense, right? If, you know, they're evolved to live with these certain plants for gazillions of years and then the plant disappears in relatively short time, it's going to be really hard to keep up. And I, again, probably don't have to tell this particular group that insects are experiencing a huge die off and we're losing, you know, insects from every group at very alarming rates. And insects are extremely important. So, you know, if only for the bugs, native plants are extremely helpful and really, really important. And for, you know, baby birds too. Who doesn't love baby birds? They need those caterpillars. And yeah, so this is just our plug for our native plant sale. Has anyone placed their order yet? Oh, we got some work to do. Okay. Yeah, so we're still open until the pickup day is March 1st. So we're keeping the sale open until the end of February this year. It's a little longer than last year. So there's still plenty of time. All these species we featured, like we mentioned, are still available. There are some things sold out, but still lots available. So that information again is in the handout from this PowerPoint, or if you just go to our website, you'll see the link to the plant sale. And the prices are very affordable because we get them right from the nurseries and try to offer them at, you know, almost basically the wholesale price. So that's our plug. And the money, of course, goes to our native plant program to help, you know, spread the word and do these sorts of talks and all of that fun stuff. And then this was just the last bit, throwing some resources up that you probably, you know, already know about. Our website, if you haven't read the work of Douglas Tellamy, I'm sure most of you have, but if not, you should. Oregon Flora is an awesome resource for native garden planting because you can put in different site conditions, bloom times, colors, all these different factors, and it'll kind of pop up the native plants that'll work for you. And I think that's about it. Do we have, you want us to take some questions? Do we have time? Okay, if there are any questions.
We got one in the chat.
Oh, we did, okay.
How about the clay yard? So much of you said not good for clay, not good for standing water. I got a dry, hot yard.
Yeah. Yeah, things with like really tough roots or rhizomes are great for clay. Like one that pops to, or actually two that pop to mind that often coexist together are like goldenrod and aster, our aster species, because they plow down through that clay with those big, you know, chunky rhizomes, and they will spread through like even, you know, dry summer clay. So those are two that pop to mind. Again, using tools like our website, our database, looking for that, or the Oregon Flora database, and just kind of filtering out for clay, you'll get some really good results. But again, it's one of those, like, you can even try if there's, you know, a 10-foot area that you want to mix in like a little bit of compost to break up the clay a little bit. That's always something cool to try. Yeah. That's a tough one, but like Sierra said, it's really common around here, and there's definitely natives that do great in clay. So yeah.
How about camas?
We do have camas. We mostly sell those at our native bulb and seed sale, which is in the fall. So we sell the bulbs for those. We do have some camas, like 4-inch starts in our plant sale. If they're still, I can't remember off the top of my head if they are still available.
Camas. No.
Yeah, camas is another like pretty hardy one, I'd say, or at least a good spreader. Yeah. Oh, what was in the chat? Oh, where can online people get the handouts? So they're going to put the physical ones in here in the Sunset Building. Also, I will upload it to our website. So this event is listed in our like events calendar. So if you click on this event, I'll attach the PowerPoint to that event. Or you can always just email Lynn, who can email us, and we can make sure you get the info.
Your plant lists are on site.
Yeah, all of these sheets are digital on our site. We have like a whole learn about native plants section with like all these resources and a ton more. We have free garden designs. I think you did a couple of them for us, Signa. Yeah, so lots to explore in there, but you can always reach out, give our office a call, and we're always happy to chat with people.
I had a question.
Oh,
Wondering, the plants that you went over tonight, are those for a wide range of pH conditions? Like, I
Ooh,
think of
good
the
question.
Sides of the valley that's acidic.
Yeah, you know, that's,
Did
do
we
you,
read
do you
the
have a,
question
oh
for
yeah,
the-
for the online people, they were asking about, like different pH, ranges for different plants, which we didn't really include. So off the top of my head, I'd have to check. I do know, like, I think the Mahoney is like a little bit more acidic soil, right?
They tend to be in, yeah.
Because they
forest.
tend to be in more like evergreen forests. I was reading recently that the effect of like pine needles on the acidity of soil is less than people think. Unless it's, you know, like eons of pine needles on top of the soil, which does exist in places. But if you have like a pine tree, it's not like your whole yard is then more acidic. Like that effect is not as significant as maybe we had thought. So definitely something to do research on. And that might be in the Oregon Flora database too, like picking acidities for your plants.
Yeah, for far as soil, I'm not a soil scientist. We do have a soil
We do
scientist
have
on
a soil
staff.
scientist.
Her
Give
name
us a
is
call.
Teresa. But I would encourage if anyone knows about the NRCS soil web survey, you can go in and type in your address and kind of look at different properties of your soil based on their aerial surveys. I was just on a site visit with Teresa and a person that does soil samples, and he was kind of going through the process of like explaining how that survey like got done and ground truthing. So it could be a resource for you to look at. I'm not sure if pH is specifically listed on there, but there's something to check out.
What does NRCH stand for?
Oh,
Natural Resources Conservation Service.
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
remember.
So we work really closely with NRCS because they have a lot of funding for like farmers, not necessarily backyard gardeners, but people who are looking to do like crop covering with their black or their blueberries or hazelnuts and things like that. So we work quite a bit with NRCS on with our more agriculture folks. But they are a really great resource and they have more soil focused people too. We have an amazing soil scientist. So if you ever want like a soil survey or have questions about your soil, definitely give us a call and Teresa will come out and geek out with you about soil and share all of her amazing knowledge. Yeah.
Same as the web.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I sort of have two questions, but they're related. First, is the monkey flower, is it spread by seed or is it a perennial?
I think it's seed mostly.
It spreads, yeah, it can self-seed and then,
I have a lot of.
yeah, and then it spreads by ribosomes too.
Related to that, last year I got a Madia elegans.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Already.
That's a tarweed.
That's a start.
Uh-huh.
From people at the Union Garden Club who are working on the Homegrown National Park.
Oh yeah.
project.
Mm-hmm.
And it did fabulously. And I'm sure it's seeded around,
Yep.
but I have no idea what the babies look like.
Oh, so it's
I'm
hard
afraid-
to, yeah,
It's a resource where you can see
like
what
the little version.
really little
Okay.
natives. look
You
like.
would know
Yeah.
better than me, but that
Okay.
is a frustrating thing. Like,
Oh
how
my
do I know
gosh.
if this baby is a weed or what I want.
Yeah. Okay. Just to reiterate for people on Zoom, the first question is about monkey flower and about if it seeds, or if it spreads by seed or rhizomes or roots. It's both. And then the other question we just got was about Madia elegans, which is a tarweed. And the question was, how do I know, little sprouts, like little baby sprouts, if this is a Madia or if it's a weed? And to answer your question, Madia is called tarweed for a reason. It is very sticky. And so, I mean, it's really hard to tell what little starts are, germinates are in the spring. Like even me, I was just on a site visit last week and somebody was asking me like, what is this thing? And I was like, I recognize it, but also it's been a year since I've seen it like grow up. So I would, it's kind of a weird piece of advice, but I would literally encourage you to go like kind of just pluck at them and just like see if they have like a sticky feel,
Mhm.
because that's why they get their name, tarweed.
That one.
Yeah, I don't know
I'd
when
like
they
to
developed
check
that.
For things like that, might be the Oregon Flora website. 'cause they
Yeah.
have A lot of photos of each plant and they
Yeah.
like us.
Yeah, they do have like kind of a photo
Try to
database.
find people.
Someone suggested to check out, Oregon Flora, because they tend to have a bunch of different photos of the species at different life stages too. Yeah. Other questions?
I don't see any more online.
Anybody online have questions? You can also unmute to just ask too, if that's easier. Want to make sure everybody gets heard. Yes.
Do the sheets over there talk about new resistance?
I don't know if that's a category on there.
There's not, okay, so the.
And
yeah,
here's why, because deer,
I was
oh,
gonna,
yeah.
yeah. The question was for the site condition sheets that we have here in the Sunset Room. They're also available on our website. If you just type in site conditions, they'll come up. But the question was, is there a category for plants that are deer resistant?
and we have, that might be something we work on in the future, is those types of lists.
I was
Do some
gonna,
of them have? Yeah.
6 on the top of.
Yeah, I don't know if, at least on dry sun. Yeah.
Special uses, and then there's a 6 in several of them.
But I bet 100 native plants that one of you is going to look at that list and say, oh, but my deer eat this thing, right? Because we, every time we say this is deer resistant, that's always the answer. It's like, but the deer eat this. So there are some that are definitely like, I mean, really obvious things like Oregon grape that are so tough and prickly. Those aren't very palatable, right? Their deer are less likely to eat those, but maybe they'll nibble like the flowers. I don't know. But yeah, we're working on kind of some more of those sorts of resources where you can cross-reference for like deer and pest resistance and those sorts of things. But I would really encourage you, for, even though it's a ton of work, if you're planting like 50 species, kind of Googling each species and getting to know it as much as you can, and, searching for like, is, this plant deer resistant, and seeing what comes up. Because a lot of times you'll get some great info just from, messaging group, like chats and things like that, from other gardeners who can tell you from firsthand experience, what they've seen. Because those deer, they have their own minds, especially the babies. They like sample everything, right?
just try everything.
Yeah. Which is unfortunate for us if people only plant like one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, I'll take it out.
Okay.
To do. Oh, great.
There's a rubber band.
So raffle prizes are at the back, about that time of year when you're looking and starting to get ready to plant cards. So we have garden planners back here. Garden planners, that's the raffle prize tonight. Oh, why don't you this? Oh, okay, great. It's slipped away. Okay, and the winner is 580346. Oh my gosh. I'm right. There's another one. Yeah.
You have to have two good arms to get.
580200. It's Pat. All right. Some juice and oh, thanks.
Seeing you. I'll be seeing you at this.
Like a clamshell, like a green inside.